For all the linen lovers out there, this peplum top is a great pattern for that crisp, breathable fabric. I'm also envisioning another version made out of lace as another great warm weather option. This unfettered pattern has a roomy fit, a gathered seam, and a top-stitched neckline facing, probably my favorite element of the design. We're gonna sew it together now. It won't take long. Here we go. Place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the shoulders and the side seams. Then we'll sew the shoulders and side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and press the seams toward the back of the garment. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your front and back facing pieces. Then place the front and back facing pieces right sides together along the shoulder seams and pin in place. Sew the shoulders at a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Now that my facing pieces are sewn together and the seams are pressed open, finish the raw edges along the outside in your preferred method. I'm going to be using my serger. Place the facing right sides together with the raw edges of the neckline matching the shoulder seams and the center front and center backs. Pin in place all the way around. Once that's pinned, we'll sew the facing to the neckline all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now that the facing is attached, we're going to understitch the facing. Turn the facing over its seam allowance, and we're going to stitch the facing to the seam allowance underneath all the way around with about an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now my facing is understitched. I'm going to turn the facing to the inside of the garment along the main seam and give that neckline a good press. Using a tailor's ham will help you get a nice clean press around those curves. Now I'm going to turn my bodice inside out, and we're going to sew the facing to the bodice along the bottom of the facing and along those finishing stitches, all the way around. Before I sew together this underarm seam of the sleeve, I'm going to finish the bottom raw edge. And once it's finished, I'm going to press the bottom edge to the wrong side by the seam allowance of 3/4 of an inch. Now that I've formed a memory crease at the bottom here, I'm going to open out that fold and place the sleeve right sides together along the underarm and pin in place. Sew this underarm seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together, then press the seam toward the back. Fold that bottom hem along your pre-press line, and we're going to hem the sleeve, sewing right along our finishing stitches all the way around. Turn the sleeve right side out, and with your bodice wrong side out, place the sleeve into its corresponding armhole matching the underarms and the notches, and pin in place. Now that my sleeve is pinned in place, I'm going to sew all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together. Pin the peplum pieces right sides together along the side seams. Sew each side seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and press those seams toward the back of the garment. Now, just as I did for the bottoms of the sleeves, I'm going to finish my raw edges all the way around and then press that hem to the wrong side by 3/4 of an inch. Then I'll sew close to my finishing stitches all the way around to finish the bottom hem. To form the gathers, we're going to sew basting stitches all along the top edge within the seam allowance at about 1/4 of an inch. Set your machine to your longest stitch length and begin sewing at one seam all the way along the top until you reach the opposite seam. Then begin a fresh set of stitches on the opposite side of that seam, continuing to stitch all along the top until you're back where you started, once again leaving thread tails. Place the raw edges of the peplum and the bottom of the bodice right sides together, aligning the centers and the seams, and pin in place at those points. Now you can begin pulling your basting stitches from the side seams on both sides so that the peplum fits the bottom of the bodice, and pin in place. Now I have my peplum attached to the bodice. I'm going to sew all the way around with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together, then press that seam up toward the bodice. And now the peplum top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.